Imagine stumbling upon an invention that could instantly transport you anywhere in the world, only to realize that a tiny, unnoticed mistake during the process could slowly erase your humanity from the inside out. It starts out feeling like the ultimate breakthrough, a sudden rush of absolute power and peak physical perfection. But beneath the surface, your genetic code is being rewritten, turning your own body into a prison that slowly morphs into something unrecognizable. The story begins at a crowded Meet the Press event hosted by Bartok Science Industries. An eccentric and brilliant scientist named Seth Brundle strikes up a conversation with Veronica Quaife, a journalist working for Particle magazine. Hoping to impress her and secure coverage for his work, Seth invites Veronica back to his massive, cluttered warehouse apartment, which also serves as his personal laboratory. When they arrive, he shows her his life's work, a pair of large, metallic booths connected to a central computer system, which he calls telepods. Seth demonstrates their capability by placing Veronica's stray nylon stocking into one pod and activating the machine. Within seconds, the stocking vanishes in a flash of light and perfectly materializes in the second pod across the room. Seth explains that this device is capable of instantaneous teleportation, a technology that could completely revolutionize human transport. Veronica recognizes the monumental scale of the discovery and immediately wants to publish an article about it. However, Seth pleads with her to hold off, explaining that the project is not yet complete. He reveals a major limitation. While the telepods can transport inanimate objects flawlessly, they fail completely when it comes to living tissue. To demonstrate this to a skeptical Veronica, Seth brings out a live baboon and places it inside the first pod. When he initiates the sequence, the machine experiences a violent error, and the animal that emerges in the receiving pod is horrifically turned inside out, dying instantly. Seeing the danger and the incredible potential of the project, Veronica agrees to a compromise. She will stay at the warehouse and document Seth's ongoing work from the ground up, keeping it completely secret until the machine is perfected. As the days turn into weeks, Seth and Veronica spend nearly all their time together in the warehouse. Their professional relationship naturally develops into a close romantic bond. During one of their quiet moments together, the two share their first intimate encounter. Shortly afterward, while eating a meal, Seth gains a sudden flash of inspiration regarding the telepod's programming flaw. He realizes that the computer system handles living matter too mechanically. It doesn't truly understand the concept of living flesh, instead trying to process it like a solid, inanimate object. Seth immediately sits down at his terminal and begins completely rewriting the software, teaching the computer to appreciate and adapt to the complexities of organic tissue, rather than just scanning it line by line. To test the updated program, Seth acquires a second live baboon. He coaxes the animal into the sending pod and initiates the teleportation sequence once again. This time, the process goes smoothly. The baboon vanishes and reappears in the second pod completely intact, healthy, and showing no signs of distress or physical damage. Overjoyed by the success, Seth believes he has finally conquered the final hurdle of his invention. He wants to immediately celebrate the breakthrough with Veronica, planning a romantic evening together. However, before they can start celebrating, Veronica suddenly gets up and leaves the warehouse without fully explaining why, leaving Seth alone and disappointed. In reality, Veronica has rushed off to confront Stathis Barans, her editor and former lover. Stathis has discovered the nature of the telepod project and, driven by a mixture of professional ambition and romantic jealousy, is threatening to publish the story without Veronica's consent. While Veronica is away attempting to manage the situation and protect Seth's secret, Seth remains at the warehouse, growing increasingly anxious. He begins drinking heavily to cope with her sudden absence. In his intoxicated state, Seth becomes consumed by paranoia, mistakenly believing that Veronica has abandoned him to rekindle his past relationship with Stathis. Fueled by a toxic mix of alcohol, jealousy, and a desperate desire to prove the worth of his invention, Seth decides to take the ultimate risk. He decides to test the telepod on a human subject, himself. Seth steps inside Telepod 1 and seals the door, ready to initiate the sequence from the internal controls. Unbeknownst to him, a common housefly buzzes into the pod at the exact moment the door closes, trapping itself inside the small chamber with him. Seth activates the machine. The teleportation process triggers, and in a brilliant flash of light, both Seth and the fly are dematerialized. A moment later, the receiving pod across the lab opens, and Seth steps out. He looks at his hands, checks his body, and breathes a sigh of relief. The process appears to have been a flawless success, leaving him completely unharmed and seemingly normal. Shortly after the experiment, Veronica returns to the warehouse. Seth does not tell her about his solo test right away, but she immediately notices a dramatic shift in his behavior. Seth is bursting with an unprecedented amount of energy, stamina, and physical strength. He demonstrates his newfound abilities by effortlessly performing intense gymnastics on a structural beam in the lab. Over the next few days, these changes intensify. Seth develops a massive, insatiable craving for sugar, dumping heaps of it into his coffee. His personality shifts as well, transforming from an eccentric, gentle scientist into an arrogant, aggressive, and increasingly volatile individual. He spends hours lecturing Veronica about the physical purity and ultimate liberation provided by the telepod, eventually pressuring her to go through the machine herself so she can experience the same awakening. Terrified by his erratic behavior and the unnatural changes in his personality, Veronica firmly refuses and tries to urge him to calm down. Seth's frustration boils over, and he leaves the warehouse to roam the city streets, looking for a way to burn off his excess energy. He enters a local bar, where his heightened aggression quickly leads to a confrontation. He challenges a massive man to an arm-wrestling match, easily overpowering him and snapping the man's wrist with terrifying ease. Seth then brings a woman named Tawny back to his lab, planning to take her through the telepods with him to share the experience. Before they can enter the booths, Veronica arrives and intervenes, warning Tawny about the dangers and forcing her to leave. Seth reacts with fury, accusing Veronica of being holding him back out of jealousy and fear of his superior evolution. However, the apparent benefits of the teleportation soon begin to give way to a horrific physical decline. Not long after the confrontation, Seth is in the bathroom when he notices something wrong with his hands. With very little effort, he pulls one of his own fingernails completely out of its bed, followed by another. A strange, thick fluid begins to ooze from his fingertips. Realizing that his body is actively breaking down, a panicked Seth rushes to his computer terminal to examine the recorded data logs from the night of his solo teleportation. He commands the computer to analyze the sequence, and the system reveals the dark truth. The telepod's computer was confused by the presence of two separate genetic profiles in the pod at the same time. Instead of keeping them separate, the system merged Seth and the housefly together at a molecular genetic level during the reconstitution process. Over the course of the next few weeks, Seth's condition deteriorates at an alarming pace. His skin becomes heavily discolored, covered in coarse, dark hairs, and marred by massive, irregular lesions. His physical appearance warps so dramatically that he looks less human with each passing day. Recognizing the inevitability of his transformation, Seth begins to document his own decay, referring to his changing identity as a hybrid entity he calls Brundlefly. The changes are not merely cosmetic. He begins to exhibit the biological traits of an insect. He discovers that he can no longer digest solid food normally. Instead, he must vomit a highly corrosive stream of digestive enzymes directly onto his meals to dissolve them into a liquid slurry before sucking it back up. He also finds that he can easily scale the vertical walls and ceiling of his warehouse, clinging to the surfaces with unnatural strength. Despite the horror of his situation, Seth's intellect remains functional for a time, allowing him to analyze his own psychological decay. He realizes that his human reason, empathy, and morality are slowly dying, being actively overwritten by the primitive, brutal survival instincts of the insect. Desperate to find a way to halt or reverse the genetic takeover, Seth begins working on a new software configuration for the telepods. He designs a fusion program, theorizing that if he can place himself in a pod alongside a pure human subject, the computer can compress and integrate their DNA, effectively diluting the fly genes in his body and restoring his human form. Meanwhile, Veronica is dealing with a crisis of her own. She visits a doctor and receives confirmation that she is pregnant with Seth's child. The news fills her with absolute dread, as she has no way of knowing if the baby was conceived before or after Seth's fateful teleportation. Terrified that she might be carrying a grotesque, mutated insect hybrid, she makes the painful decision to undergo an abortion. She enlists the help of Stathis, who agrees to drive her to a private medical clinic to have the procedure done immediately. However, Seth utilizes his enhanced senses to track Veronica down. Just as the doctor is preparing to begin the procedure, Seth bursts into the clinic room through a window. His appearance is now deeply monstrous, his body hunched and his face severely deformed. He grabs Veronica, easily overpowering the clinic staff, and abducts her, carrying her back to his warehouse laboratory. Once there, Seth confines her and desperately begs her to carry the pregnancy to term. He views the unborn child as his final lifeline, the last remaining piece of his pure, untainted humanity that will survive long after his body completely succumbs to the insect. Veronica, deeply heartbroken, but terrified of what the child might become, tearfully refuses his pleas. Determined to save Veronica from the monster, Stathis arms himself with a shotgun and breaks into the warehouse lab late at night. He moves cautiously through the cluttered space, trying to locate Veronica. Suddenly, Seth ambushes him from above, dropping down from the ceiling with terrifying speed. Stathis attempts to aim his weapon, but Seth violently disarms him. Seth pins Stathis to the floor and unleashes his corrosive digestive fluid, spraying it directly onto Stathis's left hand and right foot. The powerful enzymes instantly dissolve the flesh and bone, leaving Stathis severely maimed and screaming in agony on the floor. Seth drags Stathis's crippled body across the room, preparing to finish him off. Veronica manages to break free from her confinement and screams at Seth to stop, drawing his attention away from the dying editor. Seth turns back to Veronica and decides it is time to execute his final, desperate plan. He reveals that he has set up a 3-pod configuration, incorporating the original telepod prototype alongside the 2 main units. His plan is to place Veronica and their unborn child into telepod 1, place himself into telepod 2, and use the fusion program to merge all 3 of them into a single interconnected entity inside the receiving pod, creating what he calls the ultimate family. Veronica fights back with all her remaining strength as Seth begins dragging her toward the first booth. As she frantically claws at his face to break his grip, her fingers catch on his loose skin, and she accidentally tears his entire outer human jaw and facial flesh completely away. The trauma triggers the final, catastrophic stage of Seth's metamorphosis. The remaining layers of his human skin slough off and fall to the floor, revealing a massive, grotesque, gray insectoid monster underneath. The fully realized Brundlefly creature lets out a piercing screech. It uses its powerful appendages to forcefully shove the terrified Veronica into Telepod 1, slamming and locking the door behind her. The creature then crawls across the lab and enters Telepod 2, closing the door to initiate the countdown sequence. The central computer terminal flashes, showing that the three-way fusion process has been successfully activated and is counting down to 0. Nearby, Stathis, despite his catastrophic injuries and immense pain, manages to drag himself toward his dropped shotgun. Using his one remaining good hand, he aims the weapon at the thick power cables feeding into Telepod 1 and fires. The blast severs the main power lines, instantly short-circuiting Veronica's pod and causing its door to pop open, allowing her to scramble out onto the floor unharmed. Inside Telepod 2, the computer detects the sudden loss of the first pod, but proceeds with the remaining cycle. Sensing the failure, the Brundlefly creature attempts to burst out of its booth just as the dematerialization sequence fires. The machine experiences a massive structural error during the reconstitution process. When the doors of the receiving pod finally burst open, a horrific sight emerges. The creature has not been cleanly teleported. Instead, the computer has violently fused the insect monster together with the heavy metallic framing, wires, and shattered door components of Telepod 2 itself. This agonizing, multi-limbed fusion of flesh and machinery crawls out of the pod, dragging its mangled, heavy metallic components across the laboratory floor. It leaves a thick trail of dark fluid behind as it stops directly in front of Veronica. The dying creature can no longer speak, but it slowly raises one of its twisted, metal-fused appendages, gently guiding the barrel of Stathis' shotgun until the weapon is pressed firmly against its own deformed head. It looks up at her, silently begging for an end to its endless pain and horrific existence. Veronica stares down at the creature that used to be the man she loved, her hands trembling violently as she holds the gun. She hesitates for a painful moment, overwhelmed by grief and horror. Finally, she pulls the trigger. The gunshot echoes through the silent warehouse, instantly ending the creature's suffering. Veronica drops the weapon to the floor, falling to her knees in absolute anguish as the nightmare finally comes to an end.
If you enjoyed this recap and want to dive into more movie stories with us, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next full story breakdown. Drop a comment below to let us know what movie we should cover next. And thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.